He was born into one of the wealthiest families in Florida. He had a trust fund that most musicians could only dream about, and a talent that people who heard him once never forgot. He was also the son of a man who couldn't outrun his own darkness, the child of a mother who drank herself to death, a Harvard dropout who wandered into one of the most important careers in the history of American music, and a ghost story that ends in the California desert. Graham Parsons was 26 years old when he died. He had already changed everything. This is his story. The Snively Fortune and the Unhappy House. To understand Graham Parsons, you have to start with the money, not because the money made him happy, but because the money made the tragedy possible. Graham's maternal grandfather was John A. Snively, one of the most successful citrus magnates in Florida history. Snively had started as a fertilizer salesman and transformed himself into a real estate investor and orange grove owner whose holdings in the Winter Haven area of central Florida made him worth approximately $30 million, an enormous sum in the early 20th century. His family's Magnolia Mansion sat inside Cypress Gardens, the famous Florida amusement park and botanical attraction that Snively himself had sold the land for, and that would eventually become Legoland, Florida. The Snively name was synonymous with a specific kind of old Florida money: land, citrus, sun, and the quiet entitlement of a family that had built something real and expected it to last. Graham's mother, Avis Snively, was the heir to this world. She was beautiful and difficult, and prone to the same darkness that seemed to run through the veins of everyone in her family. She married Ingram Cecil Connor II, known to everyone by the nickname Coon Dog, given either for his sad, drooping eyes or for his considerable skill with hunting dogs, depending on which person you asked, who had been a decorated World War II pilot. He was present at Pearl Harbor on December 7th, 1941, had flown combat missions, and had received the Air Medal for his service. He was also, by the time his son was growing up, a man who could not find peace. He self-medicated with alcohol. He suffered from what would now be recognized as the lasting psychological damage of sustained combat exposure. He was, by the accounts of people who knew him, a loving father when the darkness wasn't driving him, and someone entirely different when it was. Graham, born Ingram Cecil Connor III on November 5, 1946, in Winter Haven, Florida, grew up primarily in Waycross, Georgia, where his father managed the Snively family's crate production plant. It was a comfortable life by any measurable standard. The family home was a solid brick house in a pleasant neighborhood. There was money enough for anything reasonable, and some things beyond reasonable. Graham spent holidays at the Snively Mansion inside Cypress Gardens, where the money was most visible and most real. He loved Waycross. He loved Boy Scouts and hunting and fishing with his father and playing on the edge of the Okefenokee Swamp, the vast Blackwater wilderness that sat at the edge of town. He carved his name into the concrete stoop of the family home. By all accounts of the people who knew him as a child, he was a warm, bright, sociable boy who made friends easily and who genuinely loved the place where he grew up. He called his Waycross years the happiest of his life, and the people who heard him say it believed him. What was underneath the happiness was something else. His father's drinking was serious. His mother's drinking was serious. The house held love and laughter, and also the specific instability of two people who were slowly losing their grip on the lives they were supposed to be living. The money insulated the family from the consequences that poverty would have imposed. There would always be enough. There would always be another house, another school, another fresh start available. But the money couldn't fix what was wrong inside the people who had it. In December 1958, 2 days before Christmas, Coon dog Connor went to his room and took his own life. Graham was 12 years old. Christmas without a father. The timing was not accidental. 2 days before Christmas, with the decorations up and the presents already wrapped somewhere in the house, a boy who had been fishing with his father and following him around on hunting trips and learning what it meant to be a man from the person who was supposed to teach him, that boy's world ended. Graham's younger sister, little Avis, was even younger when their father died. The two children were left with a mother who was already struggling with her own depression and her own drinking, in a house that now had an absence at its centre that nothing could fill. Avis Connor grieved in the way she knew how to grieve, which was with alcohol and with motion. Moving on, remarrying, relocating, covering the wound with activity, and with the resources that the snivelly money made available for covering wounds. She married Robert Parsons, a New Orleans businessman, not long after Coon Dog's death. Robert adopted both children. Graham became Graham Parsons, the name by which the world would eventually know him. The family moved through the Florida preparatory school circuit, the expensive institutions where wealthy Southern families sent their children when the regular public schools felt insufficient and when the family needed the structure that money could buy. Graham attended the Boles School in Jacksonville, a prestigious military-style prep school, and then later schools in the Winter Haven area as the family's geography shifted between Georgia and Florida, depending on what Avis and Robert needed in a given year. The stepfather-stepson relationship was not warm. It never became warm. People who knew the family during this period described a household that was held together more by the snivelly money than by any genuine bond, and where Robert Parsons occupied the role of the man of the house without providing anything that the role was supposed to provide beyond a roof and a reliable address. Avis Parsons, meanwhile, was drinking herself toward the ending that the path she was on had always pointed toward. She had cirrhosis of the liver, the specific, irreversible medical consequence of sustained heavy drinking, and she was progressing through its stages at a pace that told everyone who knew her where it was heading. She managed to hold herself together through Graham's high school years, well enough that he could graduate, but only barely. On June 3rd, 1965, the day of Graham's high school graduation, the morning of what should have been a celebration and a beginning, Avis Parsons died. She was 36 years old, the same age her husband had been when he died. Graham graduated from high school on the same day his mother died. He was 18 years old. He had now lost his father at 12 to a wound he couldn't speak about, and his mother at 18 to the slow, cumulative damage of a life that had been dissolving for years. He had a trust fund from the snivelly fortune that would pay out when he reached the designated age, and a stepfather who was already thinking about how to position himself relative to that trust fund, and an emptiness inside him that no amount of inherited wealth was going to address. He picked up his guitar and left for New York. Greenwich Village, Harvard, and the sound he was finding. The months after his mother's death, Graham Parsons drifted to New York City, and specifically to Greenwich Village, the neighborhood that was in 1965 the center of the American folk music revival. Bob Dylan had electrified it. The Lovin' Spoonful were there. Everyone with a guitar and something to say was there. It was the place where a young man with real talent and something genuine in his chest could find an audience and a community, and a reason to keep going when everything else had given way. Graham had already been making music for years before Greenwich Village. He had formed local bands in Waycross during his high school years, the Pacers, then the Legends, playing the kind of rock and roll and Merle Haggard covers that a Southern teenager of the early 1960s would have heard on the radio and absorbed as naturally as breathing. He had heard Elvis Presley perform at the Waycross City Auditorium in February 1956 when he was 9 years old, and by every account he gave of the experience across his entire life, it had been a revelation that permanently altered the direction of everything that followed. Not just hearing the music, but understanding what music could be, what it could do to a room full of people, what it could communicate that ordinary language couldn't reach. He spent time in the village, absorbed the folk world, and then did something that surprised everyone who knew him. He enrolled at Harvard University in September 1965, declaring theology as his major. Harvard was, by the accounts of almost everyone who was there with him, far less interesting to Graham than the music scene surrounding it. The folk revival had a Boston-Cambridge chapter, and Graham was immediately more engaged with the clubs and the musicians than with his coursework. He was also, by this point, beginning to understand what kind of music he actually wanted to make. Not folk exactly, not rock exactly, but something that incorporated the emotional directness of country music into the world that rock and roll had opened up. His brief time at Harvard produced one of the most important musical collaborations of his life. He formed the International Submarine Band with other young musicians, including guitarist John Lewis. The band's sound was not folk in the traditional sense, and not rock and roll in the conventional sense. It was something that Graham couldn't quite name yet, but that he could hear clearly in his head. A blend of country music's emotional directness and rock and roll's energy, something that put the two worlds in conversation rather than keeping them separate. He lasted one semester at Harvard. In 1966, he dropped out and took the International Submarine Band to California. He was 19 years old and already pointing at something that nobody else in American music was pointing at yet. The International Submarine Band and the First Vision. Los Angeles in 1966 was the center of the American music industry, and the center of the American music industry in 1966 was not remotely interested in country music. Country music was for a different demographic, a different radio market, a different cultural world. The rock world and the country world were kept separate by the industry's organizing assumptions, and nobody was seriously questioning why. Graham was questioning it constantly. The International Submarine Band relocated to Los Angeles and began recording the music that Graham had been hearing in his head. Full-throated country songs, pedal steel guitar prominent in the mix, lyrics that dealt with the kind of emotional territory that country music had always owned. Loss, love, displacement. The longing for something that was gone or was never quite there. The album they produced, Safe at Home, was recorded in 1967 and released in 1968 on LHI Records. It arrived to almost no commercial response. The industry wasn't listening in the direction Graham was pointing. What Safe at Home was, in retrospect, was the opening statement of a musical idea that would eventually reshape American music. It demonstrated that the boundary between country and rock was not a natural feature of the landscape, but a commercial decision, and that on the other side of that decision was an emotional richness that neither genre was fully accessing on its own. Before Safe at Home was even released, Graham had made the next move. Roger McGuinn of the Byrds, one of the most celebrated American rock bands of the mid-1960s, known for their chiming 12-string guitar sound and their sophisticated take on folk rock, invited Graham to join the band in early 1968. Graham was 21 years old and had never performed at the level the Byrds occupied. He had a trust fund and a musical idea that had been forming in his head for years, and a charm and a confidence that made people immediately understand why they were in a room with him. He became a Byrd in February 1968, and the effect on the band's direction was immediate and total. The album that followed his arrival, Sweetheart of the Rodeo, recorded largely in Nashville and released in August 1968, is now considered one of the most influential records in the history of American music. The Byrds went to Nashville and made a full, honest country album. Graham sang lead vocals on many of the tracks and was the philosophical engine behind the record's entire premise. The album included songs by Bob Dylan, alongside Merle Haggard's Sing Me Back Home, and traditional country material, performed with the kind of open, genuine commitment to the genre that the rock world had never applied to it before. Country music had not been cool. Sweetheart of the Rodeo made it something that serious musicians had to reckon with. There were complications. Graham's vocals were removed from several tracks before the final release because his previous record deal with LHI Records created a legal dispute over whether he could record for Columbia. The irony was pointed. The man whose vision had produced the album couldn't fully appear on it. His contributions were restored to their intended prominence on later reissues, but at the time, the album appeared with his imprint reduced. The album was not a commercial success when it was first released. The country audience didn't trust it. It came from California rock musicians, which was suspicious territory. The rock audience didn't know what to do with it. Country music was something their parents listened to, and the rock world's snobbery about country ran deep. The people who did understand it were scattered across both worlds and connected by a feeling they couldn't entirely articulate, that something important had just been placed on the table. Something had. But Graham was already leaving. Keith Richards, the Rolling Stones, and the beautiful distraction. In the summer of 1968, the Byrds were booked to play South Africa as part of their touring schedule. Graham refused to go. He objected, loudly and consistently, to performing in a country whose apartheid system legally segregated its citizens by race. It was a principled stand that the rest of the band did not share, and the disagreement effectively ended his tenure with the Byrds before it had properly begun. In his place, Graham found himself in England, in the orbit of the Rolling Stones. He and Keith Richards had been introduced, and the connection was immediate and particular in the way that certain musical friendships are immediate. They shared an obsession with American roots music, with the Everly Brothers, with Merle Haggard, with George Jones, with the deep vein of country and soul that Richards had absorbed alongside the blues. They spent long weeks at Nelcote, the grand villa in the south of France, where the Stones were recording what would become Exile on Main Street, and at Redlands, Richards's estate in Sussex. They played music constantly, sitting around and playing the songs they loved, the old songs, the ones that had made them both understand what music could be. The friendship with Richards was genuine and significant, and also, in certain practical ways, damaging. The world that Keith Richards inhabited in 1968 and 1969 was a world of extreme chemical excess. The Stones were living and recording and socializing in ways that would eventually destroy several people around them and come very close to destroying Richards himself. Graham was 21 and 22, and moving through this world with the specific recklessness of someone who had grown up with money and without reliable adult supervision, and who had been processing grief since he was 12 years old. He missed the Byrds' tour of South Africa and their subsequent concert commitments. He was, for a period, something close to a houseguest of Richards's, welcomed, admired, genuinely beloved. But he was also absorbing habits and tolerances and a specific philosophy about excess that would eventually kill him. He eventually had to leave the Stones world and get back to work. The work, as it turned out, was going to be extraordinary. The Flying Burrito Brothers and the Cosmic American Music. Graham Parsons returned to California in late 1968 and immediately began building the thing he had been preparing to build. He and Chris Hillman, also recently departed from the Byrds, formed the Flying Burrito Brothers. The name was deliberately odd, a kind of cosmic joke. The music was not a joke at all. The debut album, The Gilded Palace of Sin, was released in February 1969. It is, by consensus among music writers and historians, one of the defining albums in the history of what would eventually be called country rock, and then alt-country, and eventually Americana. The Flying Burrito Brothers, dressed in nudie suits, the rhinestone-covered Western outfits favored by country stars, while performing music that incorporated soul, rhythm and blues, and rock and roll alongside the country framework. Graham's suits, designed by Nudie Cone, featured embroidered marijuana plants and pills, a deliberate provocation aimed at the conservative wing of country music's audience. Graham had a phrase for what he was trying to do. He called it cosmic American music. He described it as a synthesis, a music that took the emotional directness of country, the beat of rock and roll, the soul of rhythm and blues, and the spiritual openness of gospel, and brought them together into something that was genuinely American, in a way that any single genre wasn't. Whether or not the phrase was exactly right, it pointed at something real. The Gilded Palace of Sin was not a commercial success by any conventional standard. It sold modestly. Radio didn't know where to put it. Country stations wouldn't touch it. Rock stations weren't sure it was rock. The album fell into the gap between categories that Graham had been pointing at since the beginning. And in falling into that gap, it identified the gap as a place where something extraordinary lived. The Burrito Brothers continued to record and tour through 1969 and into 1970. Graham was simultaneously productive and self-destructive, a combination that seemed to be hardwired into who he was. The drinking that had killed his parents was present in his life. The drug use that had been normalized in the Stones world was continuing. He had, at various points, significant professional commitments and an equally significant inability to keep them. The second Burrito Brothers album, Burrito Deluxe, released in 1970, was less focused than the first. Graham's contributions were uneven. By the time the album came out, the band was already fraying, and Graham was already thinking about the next thing. That next thing would bring him the most meaningful musical partnership of his career, and the companion he would have at the end of everything. Emmylou Harris, and the music that was almost enough. Graham Parsons met Emmylou Harris in Washington, D.C. in 1971. She was 23 years old, performing in small folk clubs, recently divorced, raising a young daughter largely on her own, and not yet signed to a major label. She was performing wherever she could find a room willing to have her, building an audience one night at a time in the way that folk musicians did before the industry decided to pay attention to them. He was 24 and already a legend among the people who knew what mattered in American music, which was still, at that point, not very many people. He heard her sing and immediately understood what he was hearing. She had a voice of such crystalline purity and emotional depth that it functioned as a kind of opposite to his own. His voice was warm and rough-edged, carrying the specific southern quality he had absorbed growing up in Georgia and Florida, while hers was clear and high and achingly precise. She could hold a note with a steadiness that made the emotion inside it more concentrated rather than diluted. Together, they discovered something that neither could produce alone. Graham invited her to California to record and tour with him. Harris was not yet the star she would become, and the invitation carried significant professional risk on her end. She was giving up whatever small foothold she had built on the East Coast folk scene to join a musician whose commercial profile was, to put it charitably, modest, and whose personal life was, by anyone's honest assessment, chaotic. She came anyway. The music was too important not to. What they made together on the road and in the studio was extraordinary. They spent months touring together before the album sessions, playing shows across America in small venues, building the musical vocabulary that would inform the recordings. The rapport between them developed through that touring in ways that studio work alone never produces. They learned how to find each other mid-song, how to use the space between their voices, how to let one lead and the other follow, without any of it feeling mechanical. Graham's two solo albums, G.P., released in January 1973, and Grievous Angel, recorded in the summer of 1973 and released posthumously in January 1974, contain some of the most moving country music ever recorded. The duets he and Harris performed on these albums have the quality of a conversation between two people who understand each other completely. She lifts him, he grounds her, and together they inhabit the emotional territory of the songs in ways that neither could access alone. We'll sweep out the ashes in the morning. Love hurts. Hearts on fire. Return of the Grievous Angel. These are recordings that sound, even now, like they were made in a different register than most music. More honest, more vulnerable, more willing to be directly about what they were about, without hedging or posturing. Emmylou Harris has described this period in multiple interviews across the decades since. She has described Graham as her teacher, as someone who showed her what country music actually was at its core, not the commercial product it had become on mainstream radio, but the deep form it had always been, rooted in the specific American experience of loss and longing and faith and survival. She has described their musical connection as something she has spent her entire subsequent career trying to honor. What she has also described, with the characteristic honesty that defines how she speaks about him, was watching someone she cared for deeply moving towards something she couldn't stop. The excess was visible to her from the beginning. The specific combination of grief and recklessness and money and access that was organizing Graham's private life was something she could see clearly and couldn't change. In the summer of 1973, they finished recording Grievous Angel. The sessions were remarkable. The album was complete. A tour was planned for the fall. And in September, before any of it could happen, Graham drove out to the desert. Joshua Tree and the Last Night. On September 19th, 1973, Graham Parsons drove with friends and associates to the Joshua Tree Inn, a small motel in the Mojave Desert near the town of Joshua Tree, California. He was 26 years old. He had been using drugs heavily, a combination of alcohol and morphine that had been his pattern for months. He had also been spending significant time in the Joshua Tree area in the preceding years, drawn to the desert's specific quality of light and silence, and the alien beauty of the Joshua trees themselves. The place meant something to him. He had been camping in the national park with Keith Richards. He had said, to various people at various times, that he loved the desert. He checked into the Joshua Tree Inn. He spent the evening in his room. What happened across the hours of that night involves accounts that vary in their specifics, but what the toxicology report documented was an acute overdose of morphine combined with alcohol. Graham Parsons died in his room at the Joshua Tree Inn in the early hours of September 19th, 1973. He was 26 years old. He had left behind two extraordinary albums, an album with the Flying Burrito Brothers that had changed what was possible in American music, a year with the Byrds that had produced one of the most important country records ever made, and the posthumous album with Emmylou Harris that would be released in January 1974, to the kind of critical response that his entire career had been building toward. What happened next was stranger than anything in his music. The desert, the flames, and the body. Graham had told people, not formally, not in writing, not in any document that constituted a legal statement of his wishes, but in the way that people say things when they're sitting around in the desert at night, that he did not want to be buried in the ground. He had talked about wanting to be cremated in the Joshua Tree Desert, among the rocks and the alien trees that he had loved. His stepfather, Robert Parsons, had other plans. Robert was maneuvering, in the immediate aftermath of Graham's death, to have the body transported to New Orleans and to establish Graham as a Louisiana resident under that state's specific inheritance laws. If Robert Parsons could be recognized as the closest male relative and establish Louisiana jurisdiction, he could potentially control or inherit Graham's estate. The Snively Trust Fund money that had been funding Graham's life and music for years. Graham's manager, Phil Kaufman, knew about the stepfather's plan. He had also heard Graham talk about the desert, about the Joshua trees, about not wanting to be in the ground. Kaufman was not a man who was troubled by unconventional approaches to problems. He and a friend, named Michael Martin, drove a hearse to Los Angeles International Airport, where Graham's body was being held before transport. Through a combination of bluster and paperwork confusion, they persuaded the airline staff that they were authorized to take custody of the body. They loaded it into the hearse. They drove to Joshua Tree National Monument. In the Caprock area of the monument, miles from the nearest town, Phil Kaufman and Michael Martin poured gasoline over the coffin containing Graham Parsons' body and set it on fire. The fire was not a cremation in any technical sense. It was an improvised act performed by two men in the desert at night, and it consumed a significant portion of the body before being noticed and before authorities arrived. The remains, what was left, were eventually recovered and transported to New Orleans, where Robert Parsons arranged the burial at Garden of Memories Cemetery in Metairie, a suburb of the city. Phil Kaufman and Michael Martin were arrested. They were charged not with any offense related to the body itself. American law in 1973 did not have a clear statute covering what they had done, but with misdemeanor theft of the coffin. They were fined $750 each. Graham Parsons ended up in New Orleans, the city of his stepfather, rather than the city of his music, the city of an estate dispute, rather than the desert landscape he had loved. He was 26 years old. He had never gotten the chance to become old. The legacy that time finally delivered. The strange and painful irony of Graham Parsons' story is that the recognition he deserved arrived only after he was gone. In the years immediately following his death, the albums were released and appreciated by small but devoted audiences. Grievous Angel came out in January 1974 and received the kind of critical attention that his work had always deserved and rarely received while he was alive. Emmylou Harris, freed by grief into a solo career she had not originally planned, became one of the most successful artists in country music, taking the musical philosophy Graham had taught her and making it accessible to an audience that was eventually ready for it. The Byrds' Sweetheart of the Rodeo was gradually recognized as one of the foundational documents of country rock. The Flying Burrito Brothers' Gilded Palace of Sin acquired the cult status that its quality had always warranted. The concept of country rock, a genre that Graham had essentially invented through his stubborn insistence that the barrier between the two forms was artificial, became one of the defining sounds of the 1970s through artists like the Eagles, Poco, and Linda Ronstadt, all of whom absorbed either directly or indirectly the thing that Graham had pointed at first. Rolling Stone magazine eventually ranked him at number 87 on their list of the 100 greatest artists of all time. The Americana Music Association gave him their President's Award posthumously in 2003. The Joshua Tree area, the desert he had loved, where his body had been set on fire, became a kind of pilgrimage site for musicians and music fans who made their way out there specifically because of the connection to Graham. The town of Waycross, Georgia, the place where he had grown up and carved his name in the concrete and heard Elvis and called his childhood the happiest years of his life, eventually recognized him. The single-story brick house where he had lived before his father's death was preserved. People who didn't know his name went there to understand where he had come from. What the legacy can't fully address, and what the posthumous recognition can't touch, is the question of what else he might have made. He was 26. He had been building for 7 years towards something. The 2 solo albums, especially Grievous Angel, suggest a musician who was arriving somewhere important, who had learned enough from all the losses and the chaos and the excess to begin making music of genuine depth rather than just genuine promise. The career that was forming, the one that Harris would have been central to, was pointing toward a sustained body of work rather than a brilliant fragment. It never arrived. What exists is the fragment, which is brilliant enough that musicians and listeners are still discovering it decades later and responding to it with the same recognition that the people who heard him first felt. Something true is in the music, something that was entirely him and entirely real and entirely irreplaceable. What he left and what was lost. Graham Parsons grew up with everything and nothing. The snivelly fortune gave him the freedom to pursue music without the commercial pressure that shapes most artists' careers. He never needed a hit record to keep the lights on, never had to compromise the music to pay rent, never had to audition his ideas for a label executive who didn't understand them. That freedom produced some of the most uncompromising work in American musical history. It also meant he had no external structure imposing any discipline on a life that desperately needed some. The same inheritance that gave him the freedom also carried the specific damage that the Connor household and then the Parsons household had produced. A father who found no peace and ended his life 2 days before Christmas when Graham was 12. A mother who grieved by drinking and died on the morning of his high school graduation at 36. The same age Coon Dog had been. A stepfather, who was calculating rather than caring, who would later maneuver to claim the estate money from the body that he had not claimed while it was alive. A childhood that was genuinely happy in Waycross, and then suddenly disrupted in ways that never fully resolved. He found his people. Keith Richards understood him in the specific way that musicians understand other musicians who are hearing something important. Emmylou Harris heard him and found in him the teacher she didn't know she needed. Chris Hillman respected him. Roger McGuinn believed in him enough to bring him into one of the most significant bands in American music. The musicians who played alongside him in various configurations across 7 years consistently described someone of genuine visionary quality, someone who was hearing something that hadn't yet been heard and who needed help translating the sound in his head into the sound in the room. But he also never found the sobriety or the stability that might have let him build on what he was making. The excess was present from early on, normalized by the world he moved through and enabled by the money that meant consequences could always be deferred. The specific chemistry of substances that had been routine in the Stones world around Nelcote followed him back to California and became a feature of his daily life. He was treating something with it, the grief, the displacement, the particular damage of having grown up in a beautiful house that kept losing the people who made it a home. There is a version of Graham Parsons' story where he survives the night of September 19th, 1973. Where Joshua Tree is a close call rather than an ending, where he and Emmylou make 5 more albums and the recognition arrives while he is still alive to receive it. That version doesn't exist. What exists is the version where a 26-year-old Heir to a Florida citrus fortune died in a desert motel in California, having already produced enough music to earn a permanent place in the American canon. The Joshua Tree Desert sits the same way it always has, indifferent to the human stories that have played out near it. The Joshua trees grow so slowly that the ones Graham stood among in the early 1970s look almost exactly the same today. Somewhere in the rocks at Cap Rock, there are traces of a fire that burned in September 1973. And in New Orleans, at the Garden of Memories Cemetery in Metairie, there is a headstone for a man who was born in Florida, grew up in Georgia, changed American music in California, and ended up buried far from all of it because a stepfather wanted the money. He carved his name in the concrete stoop of the house in Waycross when he was a child. The house is still there. The name is still there. That is as close to a permanent home as Graham Parsons ever had. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories. She was one of the most photographed women in the world. She had a mansion painted pink from top to bottom, a husband who was a former Mr. Universe, 5 children, and an IQ she told everyone was 163. She was also a woman who had been systematically overlooked by the industry that had made her famous, who spent the final years of her career performing in nightclubs in the American South while the studios moved on without her, and who died at 34 on a dark Louisiana highway while her children slept in the back seat. The story of Jane Mansfield is not the story the press told about her while she was alive. It is more complicated, more human, and considerably more sad. Vera Jane Palmer and the Life Before the Blonde. Before there was a Jane Mansfield, there was a girl named Vera Jane Palmer, who grew up knowing, with a certainty that adults around her found both impressive and slightly unnerving, exactly what she intended to become. She was born on April 19th, 1933, in Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania, a comfortable Philadelphia suburb, the only child of Herbert and Vera Palmer. Her father was a lawyer who had done well enough to provide a settled, middle-class existence. Her mother was the kind of woman who took her own appearance seriously and passed that attention along to her daughter early. Vera Jane was a pretty child, visibly bright, and already performing in the way that some children perform almost from birth. Aware of rooms, aware of eyes on her, aware of the specific pleasure of being watched and of being worth watching. When she was 3 years old, her father died of a heart attack. He was 30 years old. The loss was quick and total, a sudden cardiac event that left a mother and a 3-year-old daughter without the man who had been the anchor of their household. Vera Jane would later describe, in interviews she gave with surprising candor throughout her career, the specific emotional quality of growing up in a house shaped by that early absence. She was young enough that she had no real memories of him. What she had was the knowledge that he had been there and then was not, and the way that knowledge lived in the household through the years that followed. Her mother eventually remarried to a man named Harry Piers, and the family moved to Dallas, Texas in 1939. Dallas was where Vera Jane Palmer became who she was going to be. She enrolled in dance lessons, violin lessons, piano lessons, lessons in viola. She studied Spanish and German with a seriousness that her teachers found notable. She was not a dilettante about any of it. She practiced with the focused discipline of someone who understood, even at 9 and 10 and 11, that the gap between wanting something and having it was filled entirely with work. She eventually achieved functional fluency in 5 languages. She played multiple instruments at a competent level. She danced with precision and confidence. She also began, from a very young age, telling anyone who would listen that she was going to be a movie star. Not, "I hope to be," or "I'd like to be." She said it with the matter-of-fact confidence of a person stating a geographical fact. Where are you from? Dallas. What are you going to do? Be a movie star. She told a gossip columnist years later, when she was already famous, that she had wanted to be a great actress since she was 3 years old. The people who knew her as a child in Dallas found the declaration easy to believe, because even at 12 and 13, Vera Jane Palmer was already someone the room noticed when she entered it. At 16, she met a 20-year-old University of Texas student named Paul Mansfield at a Christmas Eve party in 1949. They knew each other for less than a month before they married secretly in January 1950. A public ceremony followed in May when the pregnancy became apparent. Their daughter, Jane Marie, was born in November 1950. Vera Jane Palmer was now Jane Mansfield. She kept the name when the marriage eventually dissolved, and the decision was one of the shrewder professional calculations she ever made. The name was clean, memorable, American. It sounded like something you would see on a marquee. She was 17 years old, a mother, and already thinking about how everything sounded from the outside. The marriage to Paul Mansfield was, by most accounts, a reasonably warm but fundamentally incompatible arrangement between two young people who had moved far too quickly. The fights were about Jane's ambition, which was not diminishing, and about the shape of the life she wanted to build, which was considerably larger than the life Paul Mansfield seemed to have in mind. They eventually separated in 1955, and the divorce was finalized in 1958. By then, Jane Mansfield was no longer trying to become famous. She already was. Los Angeles, the Pink Palace, and the making of a persona. The journey from Dallas housewife to Hollywood actress was not immediate, but it was not slow either, and it was never without a plan. Mansfield moved to Los Angeles with Paul and baby Jane Marie, enrolled in drama classes at UCLA, and began the grinding work of getting noticed in a city where getting noticed was the primary industry. She entered beauty contests, which in the early 1950s were a legitimate pathway to professional visibility for young women who understood how the system worked. She won many of them. She was photographed at every available opportunity, usually in ways that emphasized the obvious physical attributes that the industry was organized to respond to first. She was, by the standards of her era, extraordinarily beautiful. The blonde hair, the measurements that the press reduced to numbers and printed as though they were facts about her worth knowing, the face that combined something girlish with something extremely knowing at the same time. She understood how to be photographed. She understood how to walk into a room. She understood the grammar of being desired in public. And she used that understanding with a deliberateness that the people who worked with her in this period found striking. She appeared in minor film roles starting in 1954. She had small parts in Pete Kelly's Blues and Illegal in 1955. She won the title of Miss Photo Flash in 1952 and followed it with a string of other beauty titles that kept her name in print and her face in front of photographers. She was building, methodically, and with a strategic patience that her public persona was always obscuring, towards something larger. The breakthrough came through Broadway. She was cast in George Axelrod's comedy Will Success Spoil Rock Hunter, which opened on Broadway in 1955. The play was a satire of the Hollywood publicity machine, and Mansfield played Rita Marlowe, a thinly veiled Marilyn Monroe figure, a blonde bombshell being consumed and exploited by an industry that wanted her image and was indifferent to her humanity. The meta-quality of the casting was not lost on critics or audiences. Here was a genuine Hollywood blonde, playing a satirical Hollywood blonde on a New York stage, while the real Marilyn Monroe was already becoming something too enormous and too complicated for the industry to manage. The irony was several layers deep, and Mansfield played every one of those layers with an assurance that impressed New York audiences who had come expecting to be mildly entertained and left having witnessed something more interesting. She was brilliant in it. She won a Theatre World Award for Promising Personality in 1956. She won a Golden Globe for New Star of the Year, Actress, in 1957. She appeared on magazine covers across America and Europe. She gave interviews that were simultaneously very calculated and very clever. She played up the bombshell image while dropping remarks that demonstrated, to anyone paying attention, a sharp and self-aware mind that found the image both useful and occasionally exhausting. In 1956, 20th Century Fox signed her to a contract. She reprised her Rita Marlowe role in the film version of Will's success Spoil Rock Hunter in 1957 alongside Tony Randall. She appeared in The Girl Can't Help It in 1956, the rock and roll comedy now remembered as one of the defining commercial documents of the music's early moment, featuring Little Richard, Fats Domino, Eddie Cochran, and Gene Vincent performing live. Mansfield's physical comedy throughout the film was precise and genuinely funny in ways that most of her contemporaries couldn't match. She was also, by 1958, about to make the decision that would define her public image more completely than any role she ever played. Mickey Hargitay and the Pink Palace Years. Miklos Mickey. Hargitay was born in Budapest, Hungary in 1926 and had arrived in the United States as a refugee after the Second World War. By the time he met Jane Mansfield in 1956, he was the reigning Mr. Universe, a bodybuilder of extraordinary physical development who had translated his title into a modelling career and then into minor acting roles. He was working as one of the featured performers in Mae West's travelling variety show, which was how he and Mansfield ended up in each other's orbit. They were introduced in late 1956, and by every account of both of them across their years together, the connection between them was immediate and genuinely felt. He was physically extraordinary and, by all accounts, genuinely warm, a man whose public persona as a muscle-bound spectacle was considerably more modest and grounded than his appearance suggested. She was everything she appeared to be, and more. The press went immediately into a frenzy because the visual of the two of them together, the blonde bombshell and Mr. Universe, both larger than ordinary life in almost every measurable dimension, was exactly the kind of image that the gossip machinery of the 1950s ran on most efficiently. Mae West, who had a proprietary relationship with her male performers and a very specific sense of what belonged to whom in her company, reportedly made her displeasure about the developing relationship known directly to Mansfield. Mansfield declined to be deterred. The two were engaged by the end of 1957 and married on January 13, 1958, in Palos Verdes, California, surrounded by family, friends, and a significant number of press photographers who ensured the ceremony was covered in every major publication. Their home was the Pink Palace, a mansion on Sunset Boulevard in Holmby Hills that Mansfield had purchased for a reported $76,000, and that she proceeded to decorate in a way that made it an internationally recognized landmark of maximalist extravagance. Everything was pink. The carpets were pink. The walls were pink. The bathrooms were pink. There was a heart-shaped bathtub. The swimming pool was shaped like a heart. There were stuffed pink animals in the pink rooms. A palm tree grew through the floor of one room because the construction had required working around it, and Mansfield had decided the palm tree was staying. The house was simultaneously absurd and magnificent, and completely, unmistakably hers, a declaration in architectural form of who she intended to be and how much space she intended to take up. They had 3 children together: Miklos, Mickey, Hargitay Jr., born in 1958, Zoltan Hargitay, born in 1960, and Mariska Hargitay, born in January 1964. Mariska was born after the divorce proceedings with Mickey were already underway, the result of a reconciliation before the separation became final, which produced one of the great second acts in American entertainment history, though that story would take decades to fully arrive. The marriage to Mickey was the most genuinely happy, sustained period of Jane Mansfield's adult life by most available evidence. She described it in a 1958 interview as something so beautiful that most people never experience it. He described her in terms equally warm. They brought their children with them everywhere, on location for films, on tour for stage performances, to every engagement the schedule permitted. She told a reporter that she didn't believe in having children and leaving them to someone else. They were hers, and she kept them close. The domestic picture that the Pink Palace contained, the heart-shaped pool and the pink rooms and the children running through all of it, and Mickey doing one-armed push-ups in the backyard while Jane planned her next career move, was real, not constructed. It was, in its maximalist way, a home. But the career that had been moving so confidently forward was beginning to experience the first serious turbulence, and the studio that had signed her with such enthusiasm was about to make a decision that would reshape everything that followed. When Fox walked away. The comparison to Marilyn Monroe was both the thing that had launched Jane Mansfield's career and the thing that ultimately undermined it. The industry had two uses for the blonde bombshell type in the late 1950s, the original, who was Monroe, and the imitation, who was understood to be Mansfield. The imitation was, in certain practical ways, easier to work with. Mansfield was reliably on time, professionally competent, and completely lacking the volatile personal complications that were making Monroe an increasing challenge for studios and directors and co-stars. Hedda Hopper, the gossip columnist whose opinions carried genuine industry weight in that era, called Mansfield the working man's Monroe. It was meant as praise. It was also a ceiling. Fox used her well for a few years, and with genuine commercial logic. They put her in The Girl Can't Help It, the 1956 rock and roll comedy that is now remembered as one of the foundational documents of the music's early commercial moment, featuring live performances by Little Richard, Fats Domino, Eddie Cochran, and Gene Vincent, with Mansfield as the female lead, whose physical comedy matched and sometimes exceeded the energy of the musicians around her. They put her in Will Success Spoil Rock Hunter in 1957, which gave her the opportunity to do the kind of satirical work the Broadway version had demonstrated she was genuinely capable of. They put her in The Wayward Bus in 1957, the John Steinbeck adaptation that cast her against type in a dramatically demanding role. Critics acknowledged she handled it with more skill than they had anticipated, though Fox showed limited interest in pursuing that particular direction. The studio's interest in her was always conditional on Monroe's availability and cooperation, and as Monroe became more difficult to manage in the late 1950s, Fox's need for Mansfield fluctuated in ways she couldn't control and couldn't fully predict. When Monroe was working, Mansfield was unnecessary. When Monroe was in one of her periods of unavailability, Mansfield was the available alternative. The arrangement had always had an expiration date built into it, and the date arrived in 1959 when Fox allowed her contract to lapse without renewal. She was 26 years old, at what should have been the beginning rather than the middle of a major studio career. The studio system that had been the machinery of stardom for a generation was beginning to break down anyway. The old contracts, the old star manufacturing apparatus, the whole infrastructure of the vertically integrated studios was dissolving under the pressure of television and changing audience demographics and the legal decisions that had already forced the studios to divest their theatre chains. but the specific experience of being discarded by Fox after 3 years of solid professional performance, of being the one that got let go while Monroe continued, was a wound that shaped how Mansfield understood her position in the industry for the remainder of her career. She continued to work, and to work hard. She went to Europe and made Italian genre films, sword and sandal pictures, horror films, comedies, that would have been beneath consideration a few years earlier, but that now represented the available market. She performed on Broadway and on stage throughout America. She did television. She was resourceful and adaptable, and genuinely unwilling to stop working, which was itself a reflection of the discipline she had developed in Dallas as a girl who understood that the gap between wanting something and having it was filled with effort. She also, in 1963, appeared in Promises, a low-budget comedy that made history as the first American film to feature a prominent actress appearing without clothing on screen. The film generated considerable press attention. It was not the kind of attention that rebuilt a major studio career. It was the kind of attention that confirmed a particular narrative about where she was in the industry's estimation, and Mansfield was intelligent enough to understand the difference. Promises marked, in retrospect, a clear shift in the trajectory. Mansfield was not making the films of a rising or consolidating star. She was making the films of someone who had been a star and was navigating the available terrain with professionalism and pragmatism, but who was doing so at a considerable remove from the center of the industry she had once occupied. Sam Brody, Matt Simba, and the final chapter. The years from 1964 to 1967 were the most turbulent of Jane Mansfield's adult life, and the picture that emerges from the documented record is of a woman managing extraordinary pressures, professional, personal, and financial, with considerably more competence than the public narrative of her life has generally acknowledged. Her third marriage was to Matt Simba, born Matteo Ottaviano, an Italian-American theatre and film director she met while he was directing her in a stage production of Bus Stop. They married in September 1964 and had a son together, Antonio Tony Simba, born in October 1965. The marriage was troubled from the beginning and effectively ended in 1965, with a divorce finalized in 1966. Simba would go on to direct Mansfield's final film, Single Room, Furnished, a serious dramatic piece that she believed represented a genuine step toward the kind of career she had always wanted to build. The relationship that defined the final years of her life was not a marriage, but a long-term involvement with Samuel Brody, an entertainment lawyer who became her companion and representative. Brody was professionally useful to her in certain respects. He handled negotiations and represented her interests in various arrangements. He was also, by the accounts of people who knew them during this period, controlling in ways that concerned those close to her. The dynamic was one that friends found troubling, and the specific texture of it is difficult to fully reconstruct from outside. Mansfield had also, during this period, become publicly associated with Anton LaVey, the founder of the Church of Satan in San Francisco. The association has been systematically overstated in the decades since. There is no credible evidence that Mansfield was a genuine participant in LaVey's organization, rather than a curious visitor who found the theatrical spectacle interesting and press-worthy. LaVey was an extraordinarily effective self-publicist, and Mansfield's attendance at events connected to him fit a broader pattern of her willingness to appear at anything that generated coverage. But the association was real enough to produce controversy, and LaVey later made public claims about having cursed Samuel Brody following a dispute, retroactively framing the events of June 1967 as supernatural consequence. These claims need to be understood as the statements of a theatrical personality making the most of a tragedy's narrative potential. They have nonetheless attached themselves to Mansfield's story with a persistence that reflects our tendency to want dramatic explanations for dramatic endings. Meanwhile, by 1967, Mansfield had developed a genuine and polished nightclub act, performing in Las Vegas and across the American South, mixing songs, comedy, and the showmanship she had been developing since she was a child, taking lessons in Dallas. She was good at it. She could fill a room and hold it, and she enjoyed the performing the way performers who are born to it always enjoy it, even when the rooms are smaller than they once were. The audiences loved her. They came knowing who she was and left having seen something better than they had expected. In June 1967, she was booked for nightclub dates in the Gulf Coast region. She performed at the Gus Stevens Supper Club in Biloxi, Mississippi, on the evening of June 28th. The show went well, by all accounts. After the performance, she and her party prepared to make the overnight drive to New Orleans, where she had a local television appearance scheduled for the following morning. 3 of her children were in the car: Mickey Jr., 9 years old, Zoltan, 7 years old, and Mariska, 3 years old, the youngest daughter who would one day become one of the most recognized faces on American television, who would run a foundation helping survivors of abuse, and who would speak throughout her adult life about a mother she barely had time to know. Route 90, and what happened on the highway. The drive from Biloxi to New Orleans follows U.S. Route 90, running along the Gulf Coast through flat Louisiana terrain. On the night of June 28th to June 29th, 1967. The road was dark, and a thin layer of mist had settled over stretches of the highway. Not unusually dense, but enough to reduce visibility in ways that became significant very quickly. The car was a 1966 Buick Electra, a large and heavy American sedan. Ronald Harrison was at the wheel. Beside him in the front seat were Samuel Brody and Jane Mansfield. The 3 children, Mickey Jr., Zoltan, and Mariska, were asleep in the back seat. Ahead on the highway, a tractor-trailer truck operated by a driver named Vera Lee Tidwell, owned by the Swifty Muffler King Company, had slowed significantly after entering a cloud of insecticide spray. A parish truck ahead of it was dispersing mosquito control chemicals across the road, and the spray had created a haze that reduced visibility and caused the tractor-trailer to brake sharply. The truck was traveling considerably slower than highway speed when the Buick approached from behind. The Buick entered the same stretch of insecticide mist. Whether Harrison saw the truck at all in the reduced visibility before impact is unclear from the accident investigation. What the investigation documented was that the car did not slow or swerve in the seconds before collision. The Buick passed under the rear of the truck trailer in what accident investigators described as an underride collision. The trailer's rear cut through the car at approximately the level of the windshield and dashboard, shearing off the roof. Everyone in the front seat died instantly. Ronald Harrison was 20, Samuel Brody was 40, Jane Mansfield was 34. The 3 children in the back seat, below the direct line of impact, survived. Mickey Jr., who was 9, had a cut on his head requiring stitches. Zoltan, 7, had minor injuries. Mariska, 3 years old, was physically unharmed. First responders arriving at the scene found the 3 children disoriented but alive in the wreckage of the back seat. The story that spread in the immediate aftermath, that Mansfield had been decapitated in the crash, was persistent and gruesome and factually incorrect. What investigators found was Mansfield's blonde wig on the dashboard of the car, displaced by the impact. Initial responders apparently misidentified it in the shock and chaos of the scene, and some early press reports included the false claim which spread rapidly and proved nearly impossible to correct once it had taken hold. The official cause of death recorded by the coroner was blunt force trauma and cerebral hemorrhage. She was not decapitated. The correction never entirely overtook the false version, which has continued to circulate for more than 50 years. One of those persistent inaccuracies that attach themselves to sensational stories and refuse to die regardless of the evidence. She was buried at Fairview Cemetery in Pen Argyl, Pennsylvania, her birth state, the place her family had originally come from before Dallas and Los Angeles, and the Pink Palace and all the rest of it. A memorial was also placed at Hollywood Forever Cemetery in Los Angeles, where Hollywood keeps its dead. She was 34 years old. The industry, the image, and the woman inside both. One of the persistent frustrations in any honest look at Jayne Mansfield's career is the gap between what she was capable of and what the industry allowed her to do with that capability. She had, by the documented evidence of directors and co-stars who worked with her, genuine comedic timing of a specific and valuable kind. She was physically precise in the way that great physical comedians are precise. Her movements were controlled and intentional. Her sense of where the camera was and what angle served the joke was sophisticated in a way that you don't acquire by accident. You acquire it through work and attention, and a real understanding of how physical comedy operates. She had all of those things. She was also, when given the opportunity, capable of dramatic work that surprised critics who came to her films expecting only spectacle. The Wayward Bus had demonstrated that. The stage productions she was doing in the final years of her life, including the bus stop production that brought her together with Matt Simba, demonstrated it again. She was not a one-note performer. She was a performer who had been organized by the industry into playing one note because that note was commercially useful. She had an IQ she consistently reported as 163, a number that most commentators either dismissed with a smirk or treated as an obvious publicity invention. The precise number is impossible to verify at this distance, and the specific precision of it does have the feel of a publicist's touch. What is verifiable, without any appeal to a single contested test score, is a list of demonstrable accomplishments. Functional fluency in 5 languages, proficient performance on multiple instruments, academic study of dramatics at 3 separate universities, and a series of press interviews that, read closely rather than skimmed for quotable lines, reveal a mind that was tracking multiple things at once. The image she was projecting, the intelligence she was simultaneously displaying and managing, the gap between what the public thought she was and what she actually was. She was aware of the game she was playing. She was playing it deliberately. That is not a description of a person who is simply fortunate in her measurements. David Thompson, writing in the New Biographical Dictionary of Film, put it plainly. He described her as an actress trying to escape, someone who had been locked into an image by the industry and who had limited tools for breaking out of it from the inside. The image was the product. The actress was the person producing the product. They were not the same person, and the distinction mattered in ways that the industry was largely uninterested in acknowledging. The comparison to Monroe was always limiting in ways that went beyond commerce. Monroe was genuinely fragile in specific ways. The personal complications that made her professionally difficult were the product of real and serious suffering that she was managing imperfectly and that ultimately overwhelmed her. Mansfield was not fragile in that way. She was professionally reliable, personally resilient, and considerably more in control of her public image than the image itself suggested. But the industry didn't have a category for a woman who looked like Mansfield and was also competent and intelligent and reliable. It had the bombshell category. It put her in it. It kept her there. She pushed back in the ways available to her. She played the bombshell image with a satirical edge that audiences registered even when they couldn't entirely name what they were registering. She made the Pink Palace maximally absurd rather than just maximally ostentatious. There was a joke in the pink, a knowing wink at what the whole performance required. She gave interviews that pointed past the image while maintaining it. But the tools for fully escaping the category didn't exist in 1950s and 1960s Hollywood. Not for a woman, and especially not for a woman who was making money for the people who had put her in the category by being exactly what the category required. The children she loved, and the ones who carried her forward. Jane Mansfield had 5 children, and her relationship with them was one of the most consistent and genuinely documented aspects of a public life that was full of things that were documented and many things that were constructed for effect. She kept them with her. This was not standard practice for women of her professional standing in her era. Stars of her profile typically made extensive use of nannies, boarding schools, and the general infrastructure available to wealthy parents who needed their time uninterrupted. Mansfield brought her children on location, brought them to performances, built her daily schedule around their presence rather than arranging her life and fitting them into the margins. She said, repeatedly and in ways consistent enough to be believed, that being their mother was the thing she was most proud of. Mickey Hargitay confirmed this in interviews long after the divorce, that Jane had been a genuinely devoted mother, and that whatever complications their relationship had, her commitment to the children had never wavered. Jane Marie, the eldest daughter from her first marriage, grew up navigating the specific complexity of being the eldest child in a very public family, with a mother whose fame generated tabloid coverage of a particularly invasive kind. She eventually moved into acting herself, and the trajectory of her adult life reflected both the challenges and the gifts of growing up in Mansfield's world. Mickey Jr. and Zoltan, the 2 boys who were also in the back seat on the night of June 29th, 9 and 7 years old respectively, survived with minor injuries and grew up under their father, Mickey Hargitay's care in the years that followed. Both have spoken, in the limited interviews they have given, with warmth about the mother they lost before they were old enough to fully know her. Mariska Hargitay, the daughter born in January 1964 from her marriage to Mickey, was 3 years old when her mother died and was in the back seat of the car on that June night. She was physically unharmed. She grew up in the household that Mickey Hargitay, who never fully fell out of love with Jane, by most accounts, built for her and her brothers, shaped by memories of a mother she barely knew, and photographs and interviews, and the things that the people who had known Jane told her. Mariska has spoken about her mother throughout her adult life with a combination of grief and genuine pride. She has described her as someone ahead of her time, a woman with an appetite for life that was remarkable. She has credited her mother's energy and ambition as something she can still feel as a constant presence. Mariska eventually became one of the most successful actresses in American television history, playing Detective Olivia Benson on Law and Order. Special Victims Unit for more than 2 decades, becoming in the process one of the longest-running lead characters in the history of American television drama. She has also run the Joyful Heart Foundation, dedicated to helping survivors of abuse. She has said her mother never really left, that she lets her presence be known. Tony Simba, Mansfield's youngest son, described his mother as someone who loved being the center of attention and who cared deeply about being a good mother, 2 things that in her case were not in conflict with each other. He said her greatest regret would have been not growing old alongside her children. What the end said about the middle. The story of Jane Mansfield's death is often told as a sensational footnote to a sensational career. The Pink Palace and the LaVey Association and the highway and the misreported details that have taken on a life of their own in the decades since. But the death, like the life, is more interesting and more complicated than the sensational version. She was 34 years old, and she was not finished. She had single room, furnished in post-production, a film she was genuinely proud of, a serious dramatic role, something that represented a departure from what the industry had always assumed she was for. She had the nightclub act she had built into a genuine entertainment, a polished hour that drew on every skill she had developed since childhood. She had a fall tour planned. She had 5 children she was planning to grow old alongside. She had, by the accounts of people close to her in those final months, a sense of forward momentum, the feeling of someone who had survived the worst years and was beginning to see clearly what the next chapter might hold. She died not as a fading star, moving gracefully toward irrelevance, but as someone in the middle of rebuilding, using the tools of a changed industry to construct a career that looked different from what she had had in 1957, but that was real, and that was hers. The nightclub circuit she was working was not glamorous by the standard of her 20th century Fox years, but she was good at it, and she was doing it on her own terms. The NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, issued new regulations in the aftermath of the Mansfield accident, requiring underride guards on the rear of commercial trucks. These steel bars, mounted below the trailer beds of large trucks, are designed to prevent smaller vehicles from sliding underneath in rear-end collisions. Precisely the type of crash that killed the 3 people in the front seat of the 1966 Buick Electra on Route 90 on June 29, 1967. The guards became mandatory on all newly manufactured trucks following the accident. They are still required today. In the American trucking industry, they are commonly referred to as Mansfield bars. The woman who was photographed in pink rooms and reduced to measurements by the press she had courted had, through the specific accident of her death, produced a safety standard that has protected tens of thousands of lives in the decades since. That is not a consolation. It came at a cost that no regulation could justify. But it is a fact of what she left behind, alongside the films and the performances and the children and the grandchildren, and it exists in the world in the way her name exists. Outsized, unexpected, and considerably more substantial than the headline version of her life ever quite captured. Vera Jane Palmer, from Bryn Mawr, Pennsylvania, who took dance lessons in Dallas and married at 16 and drove herself to Los Angeles and put her name in lights and her children in pink rooms and herself at the center of every room she ever walked into. She deserved better than the story that was told about her while she was alive, and she deserved more time to tell a fuller version of it herself. She was 34 years old. The highway was dark. Her children were asleep in the back seat. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more fascinating stories.